He's a visiting research scholar here at the African Studies Center. He is a scientist, a policy analyst, a political economist, and a visual artist. I've noticed you have quite a few undergraduate. You have 2 bachelor's degrees and 2 master's degrees, which cover a wide range from biology and education, history, archaeology, global governance, and human security. He has a PhD from the University of Massachusetts in Boston, where he has a PhD in global governance and political economy. And he has varied research interests, all of which revolve around some aspect of policy and the environment. These include climate change policy, global environmental governance, global South climate resilience, sustainability, and many others. So we're happy to have you here today. I think it's this is the first time I've met you, even though this is your 2nd year as a visiting scholar, research scholar. So happy to see you here today. And the topic, the title of your presentation is Eco-Villages Revisited, the Role of the Media, Political Ideology, and Public Opinion in Regreening Africa.
Hey, well, thank you everyone for joining, and thank you for the introduction, Mike. I also want to express solidarity with the students. You know, I've been a grad student also for a very long time. And in the past, and you know, grad students are, you know, the grease that helps to oil those cogs that keeps universities moving forward. So it's great to be here in an environment that is, you know, all about participatory democracy, you know, and so it's great to join you all in this time. All right, so without further ado, so in recent years, well, I guess I would preface this by saying that what I present here today is part of a larger project that is looking at the idea of environmental change in the global South, which includes Latin America and the Caribbean, Africa, the Middle East, Oceania, the Pacific. And so really a group of countries, mostly developing countries, that are now tasked with this process of continuing development while facing these polycrises of biodiversity loss, climate change, and environmental degradation, right? And so this work is kind of situated within that, and it's situated there that operates from both the local meso level and the global level. And so these conversations are both cross-cutting, cross-sectorial, cross-level, and they also touch on a range of issues that are both in the past, certainly in the present, and that will have implications for the future. So in recent years, there has been an increasing debate about alternative futures of societies that choose to no longer be dependent on fossil fuels. This debate has been driven by growing concerns about high consumption lifestyles and the environmental impacts of fossil fuel dependence, such as climate change and energy security. At the heart of the debate lies the recognition that continued reliance on fossil fuels is unsustainable and poses grave risks to the planet and its inhabitants. For instance, climate scientists have long warned that unchecked greenhouse gas emissions from burning fossil fuels are driving global warming, leading to rising temperatures, more frequent and severe weather events, and disruptions to ecosystems and biodiversity. Moreover, social consequences from air and water pollution, such as habitat destruction, displacement of communities, are amplified by rapid urbanization and widening global inequality. As the world grapples with the urgent need to transition to renewable energy sources and sustainable lifestyles, eco-villages have reemerged as a potential model for envisioning and perhaps realizing alternative futures. Eco-villages are thought to offer a vision of rural and urban communities that are self-reliant, resilient, and are in harmony with nature. However, the transition to eco-villages as a mainstream response and reorganization of societal living faces numerous challenges, including technological, economic, and political barriers. While often promoted for their environmental sustainability, there is a need for additional research on the policy and governance frameworks surrounding eco-villages, particularly their relevance in Africa's green transition. There is need to examine the regulatory environment, government support mechanisms, and policy barriers that affect the establishment, operation, and scaling up of eco-villages. In contribution to this discourse, this paper entitled Eco-Villages Revisited: The Role of Political Ideology, Public Opinion, and the Media in Regreening Africa, I examine eco-villages as models for alternative futures of sustainable urban and rural living in Africa. Utilizing public opinion data, newspaper archives, mostly from the Washington Post's Foreign Service and the New York Times between 1960 to 1980, and drawing upon the intellectual traditions of political ecology and political economy. I focus on the role that these ideologies, public opinion, and media portrayals, how they surround eco-villages as part of the broader green transition movement burgeoning across the African continent. Eco-villages are ideally sufficient communities that, through adaptive design, attempt to minimize negative impacts on natural environments and becoming more socially, culturally, economically, and ecologically sustainable. Their occupants aim to minimize the ecological footprint and promote sustainability by intentional physical design as well as resident behavior choices. Eco-villages can range from populations of 50 to 200 individuals, and some are even smaller. Traditional ones can be much larger and exist as networks of smaller sub-communities. Some eco-villages have grown organically with like-minded individuals, families, or small groups settling on the periphery of society and participating in community, while others have been intentional processes by governments or collective groups of individuals who choose an alternative lifestyle that is environmentally friendly or conscious. At present, there are at least 10,000 formally registered eco-villages or ecologically oriented co-housing developments, or in more modern contexts, folks would also refer to them as sustainable communities. And there are more under construction. This movement is of particular interest and potential relevance to Africa. The Global Eco-Village Network, GEN, listed over 1,000 formal eco-villages registered in Africa. In Senegal alone, the Kolufafa is a network of 350 West African villages seeking to become more self-sufficient through organic farming, microfinance, and adult literacy, as well as health, malaria and Zika prevention. At the 25th Conference of the Parties of the United Nations Framework on Convention on Climate Change, UNFCCC, 8 African countries decided that they were going to scale up eco-villages in their countries. And this is a part of what is called the Eco-Village Development Programs. There's a group of ministers of the environment from the Gambia, Sierra Leone, Sudan, Togo, Liberia, Nigeria, and Burkina Faso. And then later, the Democratic Republic of Congo joined. And they signed this MOU as part of, which gives legitimacy and recognition of the role of eco-villages as part of climate solutions and environmental solutions at the international level. Eco-villages in their own right are viewed by some scholars as praxis for political, economic, cultural, and environmental ideology. This is putting ideological thoughts about the environment and sustainability into practice. Organized around common values, they seek to find alternatives to ecologically harmful systems, such as electrical sustainable networks, water, transportation, waste management systems, as well as larger social systems that support them. Eco-villages see the breakdown of traditional forms of community, wasteful consumerist lifestyles, destruction of natural habitats, and urban sprawl as factors that are reliant on fossil fuels. Supporters of eco-village frameworks and networks consider that these trends must be changed to avert ecological disaster and to create more fulfilling ways of life. These communities can also cooperate with other peer villages to achieve their goals. They are thought to be designed through participatory process, with an emphasis on regenerating and restoring social and natural environments. Such communities have been around for thousands of years, but have been sidelined in modernity or modern thinking as being anarchic, simplistic, or anti-capitalist. Yet at different points in time, eco-villages have been brought into mainstream discourse on solutions to environmental challenges and economic transformation. Modern eco-villages are therefore a movement that arose in response to the growing awareness of the negative impact of human activity on the environment. And so they advocate for a shift towards more ecologically sustainable lifestyle. Ralph Metzner asserts that, and I quote, "We are presently transforming from a modern industrial world to an ecological worldview, a change that is similar to the postmodern transformation of philosophy, religion, and the social and natural sciences that we have seen in decades past," end quote. Furthermore, Rees contends that, and I quote, "with the realization that our production is essentially in consumption of finite resources, and that this activity generates waste products and jeopardizes the sustainability of the biosphere in which we rely, the concept of sustainability and certainly green transitions take significant importance." Greening refers to the process of transforming environments, spaces, and lifestyles into more environmentally friendly versions. Greening proposes a holistic approach to restoring degraded ecosystems, combating desertification, promoting sustainable land management practices. And by restoring vegetation, enhancing soil fertility, empowering communities, regreening initiatives contribute to environmental sustainability, conservation, and climate resilience. And regarding the title of this presentation, Regreening is a recognition and acknowledgement that sociocultural and environmental indigenous systems in Africa existed before colonization and conquest, and that they did embody some of these characteristics that we now associate with green transitions. As Africa and the world face increased environmental challenges, regreening offers ideally a promising pathway through towards building more resilient and sustainable landscapes for future generations. This involves incorporating more environmentally conscious and sustainable systems, which eco-villages are thought to embody. As such, three paradigms have emerged: green growth, degrowth, and sustainable development. Green growth, which is most associated with the idea of the green economy, is an alternative vision for growth and development. It is focused on economic development that provides a stable economy, jobs, and improved levels of income that can improve people's lives without compromising the well-being of the environment, which has always kind of been the opposite way around. It is the opposite in some regards to unbridled capitalism and unbridled capitalist economic growth that we have become accustomed to, which depletes resources and degrades the environment for profit. Climate activists are critical of this fairy tale of eternal growth as a dangerous myth that threatens climate security. However, politics remains committed to the growth policies and economic growth that is widely regarded as being necessary for the functioning of society, that is capitalist economic growth. Growthism itself emerged from the expansionist ideas during European colonization and the industrialization of Europe, and then blossomed in the post-war period, giving rise to the modern growth paradigm. Schmelzer argues, quote, "The growth paradigm stabilizes capitalist societies. In the era of great acceleration, and undoing its hegemony is essential for climate justice." So in periods when the world or the global economy is under suppression or going through bust, capitalist ideas around growth surge. And this has been kind of the status quo. However, this economic growth became a key priority among social scientists, politicians, and the general public. And then the idea of green growth is problematic. And for Africa, it is even worse, unfortunately. Studies indicate that with the multiplier effect of climate change, achieving green growth along with meeting climate targets and continued GDP growth in Africa are incompatible. Alternative systems of growth do not take place in a vacuum. They are at all times pushing against long-established, powerful social forces of what was. and in this case, unbridled capitalism, neo-imperialism, neoliberalism, which produced and continues to be bound to a global political and economic order that is pegged to GDP growth, fossil fuels, and continues to produce climate and environmental challenges that we face today. As an example of the broader geopolitical system and socio-economic order that countries in the developing world, the global south, and in Africa find themselves, and its impact on environment, we see it in climate change. Climate change impacts are not evenly distributed around the world. Wealthy industrialized countries that mostly lie to the north of the globe, the global north, and less developed countries mostly located to the south of the globe, the global south, are experiencing climate change differently. And some would argue, well, we see floods in Italy, we see floods in Greece, we see floods and environmental impact around the world, heat waves and so on, in the US and elsewhere in the Western world. But what scholars and scientists are recognizing is that there are similar impacts to climate change in some regards. There's sea level rise, there's flooding, and so forth. However, due to pre-existing structural inadequacies, the capacity to respond either through mitigation or adaptation efforts make developing countries more vulnerable. So it's not just the impact, it's the ability to respond to the impact. Developing countries are more vulnerable to climate hazards, whether these are climate shocks, extreme weather events, or slow onset climate hazards. These events can cause significant damage to infrastructure, agriculture, and livelihoods, leading to food insecurity, population displacement, and economic losses, and possibly could compromise hard-won social and economic development in the developing world for the last 4 decades. Coastal landscapes in southern countries are at higher risk of sea level rise, storm surges, and saltwater intrusion, which can exacerbate the vulnerability of coastal communities. In addition, humid and arid regions in the global south are experiencing accelerated desertification, leading to water scarcity, displacement of biodiversity, and the depletion of farmlands. To cope with these challenges, developing countries require different priorities, as well as different types and volumes of resources. And we see through the international system, through the United Nations framework, through the Paris Agreement, that this is now being recognized more so and is connected to these advocacy points around loss and damage and so on. Africa, although a continent rich in natural resources, faces a myriad of climate risks. Also, sustainability challenges that are both distinct and complex, stemming from a combination of natural factors, human activities, rapid urbanization, population growth, and historical socio-economic disparities as a region comprised of mostly developing countries, and even more so, least developing countries. According to the World Bank, 90% of Africa's agriculture is rain-fed, making it highly susceptible to fluctuations in precipitation patterns. For instance, the 2011 drought in the Horn of Africa affected over 13 million people, leading to food shortages and humanitarian crises. These severe droughts are expected to reoccur in this decade. Meanwhile, the United Nations Environmental Program, UNEP, estimates that desertification affects about 45% of Africa's land area. One striking example is the Sahara Desert's southward expansion, which encroaches on fertile lands and displaces communities, exacerbating food insecurity and poverty. By prioritizing renewable energy, organic agriculture, waste reduction, and ecological restoration, eco-villages aim to demonstrate practical alternative to fossil-based high consumption lifestyles. But importantly, renewable energy technologies such as solar, wind, and hydropower provide clean, decentralized sources of electricity to help reduce reliance on fossil fuels and sequester carbon. And this helps to boost food security and ecosystem resilience. Waste reduction and recycling initiatives minimize resource consumption and pollution, while ecological restoration efforts restore degraded landscapes. So green growth is gaining traction. It is actually because of what it proposes and the research that has been coming out with different experimental projects that have been ongoing throughout the African continent. There is some traction, and folks are recognizing this. So it's gaining traction in decision-making processes at the national level in countries, and then at the international level, you're seeing more of this kind of discourse. However, the idea of degrowth is not gaining as much traction, although in intellectual communities around, international relations scholars and these new movements of social capitalists and so on, it's becoming, we're seeing more of the discourse around it. However, as it stands right now, and Fitzpatrick, for example, Fitzpatrick et al. Says, degrowth proposals are scattered throughout the literature, making it difficult for people to understand the changes that are being advocated, why they are necessary, and how they could unfold, as advocates have been putting forward these as solutions to socio-ecological crises. And basically, degrowth is weaning totally off this idea of GDP growth, removing the idea of fossil fuels, and almost kind of, as some authors I've come across, is going back to hunter-gatherer type of lifestyles, right? Which places them in this very kind of, extreme left, which is always kind of a challenge. But the challenge with degrowth for eco-villages is that because of the entrenched challenges in developing countries and different societies where we're seeing these popping up as proposed solutions to climate changes and environmental degradation, is that because of these disparities that exist, the socioeconomic inequalities, inadequate infrastructure, and limited access to finance, these pose a barrier to creating eco-villages. So if you say degrowth that is totally weaned from investments and profits and so on, then you don't have the resources to kind of, invest in creating these eco-villages, right? And we know that's solar and renewable energy. The initial investment to that is quite substantial. So there's some contradiction there around it. The other major ideology associated with the eco-villages movement is sustainable development, which we probably know more about. And sustainable development is described in the 1987 Brundtland report as development that meets the needs of the present generation without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. Very moral and philosophical in its stance. The desired result is a society where living conditions and resources meet human needs without undermining planetary integrity and stability of natural systems. Sustainable development tries to find a balance between economic development, environmental protection, and social well-being. The Sustainable Development Goals, the SDGs, also known as the Global Goals, were adopted by the United Nations in 2015. And I was actually an intern during that time at the UN. And it was a universal call to action to end poverty, protect the planet, and to ensure that by 2030, all people enjoy peace and prosperity. How close are we to 2030? Sustainability is the foundation for today's leading global framework for international cooperation. The 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development and the SDGs are that overarching paradigm which we find ourselves in. And it's relevant to Africa because Africa's urban population is projected to double by 2050. This growth brings new challenges. And please to note that this is not eugenics, because sometimes when people hear this, the population growth is that you will need additional resources, right? So population growth can exist and must exist, right? But it's that you put additional strain on resources. And so we have to think now how to meet those needs of the new population. This growth brings challenges, including informal settlements. According to UNICEF and the World Health Organization's Joint Monitoring Program for Water Supply, Sanitation, and Hygiene, over 60% of urban dwellers in sub-Saharan Africa lack access to safely managed sanitation facilities, while approximately 1/3 do not have access to improved drinking water sources, while over half of the urban population lack basic social services. Solid waste generation has increased due to urbanization. Many of Africa's megacities, which are some of the largest in the world, are struggling with inadequate waste management. Air pollution is also a significant concern, exceeding World Health Organization guidelines in cities such as Cairo and Lagos. Water and sanitation challenges persist. And these challenges highlight the need for a sustainable urban development in Africa to create livable, resilient cities and rural communities. And so there's the connection with the eco-villages. But there is a dilemma. There's a dilemma underway in Africa, in that each of these paradigms, green growth, degrowth, and sustainable development, is complicated in the African context. And I'll explain it. It lies in the fact that while the continent is predominantly composed of developing countries that are highly vulnerable to climate change and environmental change and degradation, there also includes oil-producing countries that contribute significantly to carbon emissions, particularly those that are members of the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, OPEC. On one hand, some countries, particularly those with significant oil reserves, rely heavily on fossil fuel extraction and exportation as a primary source of revenue and economic growth. This dependence on fossil fuels, we know, contributes to greenhouse gas emissions and, contributes to the climate challenges faced not only by Africa, but other countries in the post-industrial age. African oil-producing countries that are members of OPEC also face additional challenges related to market dynamics in oil prices. These countries must navigate complex trade-offs between maximizing short-term, economic earnings from oil production while balancing long-term sustainability goals. This creates a complex situation where African nations face the dual challenges of minimizing or mitigating and adapting to climate change, while also grappling with the economic and political implications of their dependence on fossil fuel. They're in between a rock and a hard place, as we say in my culture. And so what emerges is what I call Africa's paradoxes of being green. So although climate change was not a global issue as big as it was in today's society, scholars point to the numerous environmental challenges that affected newly independent African nations in the 1960s and onward, as they tried to marshal development in a seemingly post-colonial world. And so it's almost like we are recreating the way how climate change and environmental change has kind of emerged, so to speak, in this era. It's reflective of kind of that era, when countries were just coming out of colonization. And so Africa presents these paradoxes of being that would make it, in one regard, a champion for sustainable communities and eco-villages and sustainable living. It makes sense. And it could be realized. Yet simultaneously, this pursuit is also far-fetched and unrealistic in some regards. It is a quagmire. This possibly explains the checkered experiences of African countries that experimented with modern versions or early modern versions of eco-villages. The 1960s to 70s rise and fall of Ujamaa villages in Tanzania offers an interesting historical case. Much has been written on the Ujamaa experiences, but not nearly as much on the parallels between contemporary eco-villages as part of this regreening movement or green transition movement in Africa. What can the experiences of the Ujamaa villages teach us about why green initiatives fail or succeed in Africa? The connections between the role of political ideology, public opinion, and media is relevant. Similar to the Ujamaa villages of the past, present-day eco-villages are sites of traditional environmental knowledge and sustainability experimentation, but they are also sites of internal and external ideological contestations. challenging imperialism, colonialism, and in some sense, producing a unique form of African socialism that has been indigenous to the continent and not entirely a product of Soviet intellectual philosophy, as some scholars and critics thought. Ujamaa in Swahili means extended family or brotherhood, or sorry, familyhood, extended family or familyhood. It was a social and economic policy that was implemented in Tanzania, and there are other places as well. But in Tanzania by Julius Nyerere between 1964 and 1985. The policy was established in 1967, the Ashura Declaration. Nonetheless, Nyerere held what could be described as a conservative socialist outlook, inspired by Fabian socialism. Ujamaa were based on the idea of collective farming and the villagization of the countryside. So it's focused on rural development. Nyerere argued that European colonization had caused urbanization, which was driven by wage labor and had disrupted the traditional pre-colonial rural African society. And it's interesting that he saw it that way because 95% of Tanzania was rural at the time. So just that small boom was for him significant. Fast forward today, and we see his challenges even much bigger. He believed that his government could recreate post-colonial traditions in Tanzania and reestablish a traditional level of mutual respect, thus returning the people to settled moral ways of life. The primary way to achieve this goal, according to him, was to relocate people from urban cities, like the capital, Dar es Salaam, to newly created villages in the rural countryside. Initially, the process started slowly and was voluntary, with only around 800 collective settlements in place by the end of the 1960s. However, by the 1970s, Nyerere's reign was thought to have become more oppressive, as he began to force people to leave the cities and move to the collective villages. By the end of the 1970s, there were 2,500 of these villages in Tanzania. The idea of collective rural agriculture was considered a viable solution by Nyerere's government, bringing together rural populations in nucleated settlements, each consisting of around 250 families. The government could afford to provide equipment, facilities, and some materials. The establishment of these new groups of rural population was thought to make it easier to distribute fertilizers, seeds, and would be possible to offer a good level of education to the population. Villagization was seen as a way to overcome the problem of tribalization, an issue that plagued other newly independent African countries and led people separating in tribes based on their ancient identities. So in one regard, it was seen as being anti-colonial or wanting to go back to pre-colonial, but at the same time kind of retaining ideas of colonization. Technological innovations were introduced to rural populations, which was 95% of the population of Tanzania at the time. However, traditional ideas of families, how families operated, were no longer applicable to the reality of the people. The traditional concept of women as the devoted female domestic guardians of the family concept rooted in the village, contradicted actual lifestyles of women. It may never have worked efficiently. Women often moved in and out of working and raising children throughout their lives, embracing diversification and flexibility to provide personal security. Similarly, young men complied with the officials' orders to move to rural communities. They rejected the traditional models and distanced themselves from the older generation of male leaders in their families. They found themselves needing to be a part of waged work in the urban economy. Ironically, Ujamaa villagers rejected the communal life and withdrew from subsistence and commercial agriculture, while urban residents chose to live in cities and practice urban agriculture. Throughout the implementation of Ujamaa, transportation networks declined drastically due to neglect. Capitalist activities such as industry, banking were also crippled. In the years that followed, the country became even more reliant on international aid, while their whole goal was to not be reliant on it. However, Ujamaa was credited for some significant achievements between 1961 and 1985. This included creating a higher literacy rate, with halving infant mortality through access to medical facilities, and uniting Tanzanians across ethnic lines, thereby significantly reducing ethnic conflicts. As a result, Tanzania remained untouched by the tribal and political tensions that affected other African countries. In 1985, Ujamaa was terminated when Nyerere stepped down from the presidency in favor for Ali Hassan. This marked a significant shift in Tanzania's democratic policies and paved the way for new approaches to economic development. And so when we think about eco-villages, we recognize that there cannot be a focus or emphasis on one type of landscape, urban versus rural. There needs to be a synchronicity between them. Urban development must take place, but also, rural development must take place, but there must also be urban renewal. And so these work hand in hand. The relationship in particular between public opinion and public policy is especially important in representative democracies, where we expect elected officials to consider the views of voters or the polity. There is a large body of literature that studies whether policy reflects public preferences and how these preferences are transformed into policy. Other research explores whether or how the degree of opinion representation varies across issues and political institutions. But public opinion is both an independent variable that theoretically derives public policy change and a dependent variable that is influenced by policy itself. It is critical to the functioning of representative democracies that both policy representation and public responsiveness exist. So let's go back to the idea of green growth and degrowth paradigms, where eco-villages are thought to, can thrive. This idea, for example, of divestment is one way to wean society off fossil fuels. But as Mangat et al. Argues, and I quote, the most immediate and direct goal of the divestment movement is to stigmatize investing in fossil fuel companies. Schwartz and Nuri contend also that first and foremost, divestment signals fossil fuel companies are engaged in an illogical and even potentially immoral act. Thus, divestment from fossil fuel companies might have a stigmatizing impact where the public is less likely to view fossil fuel companies favorably. And so they're less likely to contribute to them or support policies that support these types of enterprises. But eco-villages as alternative modes of living are also subject to this, to public opinion. The collective views, attitudes, and beliefs of communities are thought to bear weight on how such projects are legitimized and how public resources are used to scale them up. While some scholars see public opinion as a combination of views of everyone of a particular segment of society, others view it as a collection of different or opposing views. The public's impact on policy outcomes vary across Africa's countries. In arguably more democratic countries such as Ghana, Botswana, and South Africa, there is evidence of this public responsiveness, where the public impacts policy and policy impacts the public. The European Investment Bank, EIB, which is the leading arm of the European Union and the world's largest multilateral lender for climate action projects and sustainable projects, in their 2022 climate survey, found that 88% of Africans they surveyed believe that climate change is already affecting their everyday life. Meanwhile, 61% of respondents believe that climate change and environmental damage have affected their income and source of livelihood. And 76% of African respondents say renewable energy should be prioritized. All of these questions and ideas are relevant to scaling up eco-villages across the continent. Yet, policy implementation that addresses these concerns have been lacking in some countries. Recent studies on countries in Africa, however, show a much more worrying sign. And it's something that we have also seen in Western countries as well, or Western democracies. These studies indicate that policy changes appear to be influenced mainly by the preferences of citizens with high socioeconomic status, the wealthy elite. However, mechanisms that explain this trend is still largely unexplored in some aspects. But what comes forward is the idea that the opinions of wealthy elites and the political elite tend to reflect more in the policy outcomes compared to disadvantaged groups. Similar biases are found in policy responsiveness as policy changes align most closely with advantaged groups that are connected to fossil fuels in most of these developing African countries that particularly are oil producing or extractive industries. And so because of the nature of the extractive industries and its role in the commanding heights of the economies of these countries, you find that the wealthy elite are usually those that are involved in this type of trade. And if policy is supposed to be reflective and responsive, then, and there is this bias where the advantaged group are the ones that are leading policy outcomes, then it is a challenge if we think about sustainability or environmental sustainability and the scaling up of eco-villages. The evidence suggests that public opinion often serves as a proximate cause of policy, and that it affects policy output more than it influences the public's opinion. It is then a cautionary tale to think that green or sustainability policies in Africa will pervasively demonstrate the idea of democratic responsiveness. For example, while renewable energy technologies have become increasingly cost effective, at least in the last decade, and scalable, fossil fuel interests continue to wield significant influence over energy policy and investments in Africa, hindering widespread adaptation of clean or renewable energy sources, particularly in oil-wealthy or oil-rich nations. And we saw with Ujamaa where the views or ideals and policies of one person or a political elite could entrench a policy that was considered by a lot of the people to be opposed to their way of life. The media particularly media representations and stories also have the potential to validate alternative green initiatives and encourage the advancement of alternative economic principles. And they can promote these initiatives as collective action or counterpower. This could create more opportunities to expand social value via partnerships with multiple stakeholders and creation of institutional formations that operate at different levels, especially among the general public. However, the press could not only sway public opinion in countries, but also international views. Eco-villages are still largely associated with socialism and communism in a capitalist world. Anthony Astran, writing for the Washington Post's Foreign Service in 1969, underscored international perceptions of Ujamaa and also the principle of rural development as it aspired to. Astran writes, quote, Tanzania is seeking many solutions to the problem of transforming rural apathy. One of its central hopes is the Ujamaa village. Ujamaa literally means familyhood, but it is transplanted here as socialism. This despite, end quote, this is despite Nyerere trying to market Ujamaa as something different, which it technically was. But in a Cold War world, it found much criticism and opposition from the people it was supposed to help. It did get some acclaim among intellectuals, but for the most part, it was always under the microscope. So are political ideologies enough, given the role and influence of the media, and given the idea that public opinion is swayed by the media, but also public opinion is also reflective of advantaged groups? Is Africa's regreening, particularly in rural landscapes, wanting something more? Jimmy Hogland, writing for the Washington Post Foreign Service in 1972, writes that, quote, the broad pattern so far has been the same across Africa, whether in socialist Tanzania or capitalist Ivory Coast. Productivity remains a problem. Rural development has been fastened on by almost all of Africa's governments as the answer to these productivity challenges. To date, however, rural development has remained an empty political promise in most countries that do not have enough money or even desire to implement it, end quote. So as we think about eco-villages And also the varying paradigms which support the scaling up or implementation of it, regrowth, green growth, degrowth, sustainable development. There's always this question of, is that enough? And I think for the African case, because it has found itself between a rock and a hard place, where you're experiencing these environmental challenges, but then your economy is dependent on extraction of these environmental challenges in one regard, and then also highly dependent on agriculture, which is very much impacted by these environmental challenges. Yeah, without having the resources and all the technologies and all of these things that are needed, again, it's a quagmire. There's always skepticism around these new and alternative environmental models. When media outlets highlight the successes and benefits of eco-villages, they can inspire positive change, mobilize resources, and influence political opinion. Documentaries, news articles, social media campaigns can showcase environmental, social, and economic benefits, raise awareness, and attract investments, and and provide a supportive policy environment to some degree. Conversely, negative media portrayals of eco-villages can perpetuate misconceptions. It can undermine credibility and hinder progress in some ways. Whether they're sensationalized stories or biased reporting or misrepresentation of eco-villages as fringe movements or radical ideologies can breed skepticism and fuel opposition that erodes public trust in these types of alternative living futures. Moreover, media narratives that emphasize conflict, failure, or dysfunction within eco-village communities can reinforce stereotypes and deter potential supporters, hampering efforts to scale up sustainable development initiatives. So in conclusion, as Africa grapples with pressing environmental challenges and strives for sustainable development, eco-villages offer valuable lessons and pathways towards greener, more equitable future for all. Yes, they represent a vision of sustainable futures that prioritize environmental stewardship, community resilience, and social equity. By demonstrating practical alternatives to fossil fuels and high consumption lifestyle, they could theoretically, and we have seen in some instances, build more just, equitable, and sustainable societies. However, realizing this ideal, in some regards almost utopian vision, may not be attainable in societies marred by a complicated colonial past and a present neoliberal world order that is pegged to extraction of resources, to GDP growth. Because of their wider establishment as a form of social and economic organizations, as a form of social and economic organization in post-colonial and Cold War era Africa, eco-villages are perceived as promoting communist or socialist ideologies due to their emphasis on communal living and resource sharing, but also because of how they were marketed or described as a response to the economic and social world order of the time, which we are still in. African eco-villages are sometimes viewed with suspicion, fearing that they represent attempts to subvert mainstream capitalist system or promote anti-government sentiments. Meanwhile, other general controversies surround eco-villages. They often revolve around perceptions of ideological alignment, retreatism, and cultism. Addressing these controversies will require deeper levels of government transparency and commitment to ethical governance and social responsibility in the public's interest and for other stakeholders participating or are expected to participate in this green transition in Africa. Such transitions will require concerted efforts from government, civil society, the public, the media, private sector, to overcome, first and foremost, technological, economic, and political barriers. The success of eco-villages hinges on public support. But if it is supposed to be articulating ideas of equity and justice, climate justice, environmental justice, it will need support from the public and not just the advantaged groups. Public awareness and education are crucial for fostering understanding and support. Media coverage and public discourse play a critical role in shaping perceptions and attitudes. It should neither be sensational nor should be misleading. Only with collective action nationally and globally can eco-villages pave the way for this green future or regreen the future for Africa and indeed the world. Learning from and building upon the values of historical experiments such as the JAMA shows the relevance of indigenous values of Ubuntu and communal living and familyhood that are rooted in African philosophy and also in social justice, which underscores a lot of the politics around climate change and environmental degradation that we're seeing now in the international community. Long-term monitoring and evaluation of environmental indicators can also help with these ecological benefits of eco-villages. Despite challenges and criticisms, eco-villages have been shown to inspire hope and transformation, transforming or challenging dominant paradigms of growth and consumption while fostering this idea of environmental stewardship and community solidarity. Thank you.
Thank you. The sound of hands clapping. Here.
And some virtual online
Yeah.
hands.
Thank you for that talk that covered quite a bit of territory. And I have a general question to ask, very subjective, but I get the impression you're very pessimistic about the future of the success of eco-villages, green growth, sustainable development, at least for the next 10, 20 years. There are a lot of hurdles to overcome.
Well, I wouldn't say I'm pessimistic about it. I'm cautious about it because looking through the historical lens, and that's why I went back to the idea of Ujamaa and the challenges there. It makes perfect sense ideologically, theoretically, but because from what I've seen with the data, with the evidence, African countries are in this quagmire of these paradoxes of greening, I call them. And it's so entangled in order to pull that out like a ball of yarn, how to detangle that will be, it's not, I don't think, the straightforward approach that we have seen or that is being advocated by all these different ideological paradigms. I think there needs to be deeper conversations, but also deeper actions, which I'm not certain that the world is ready for, or even, you know, in some cases that even Africans are ready for. Because unlike the discussions that we see in the US, which is also say very contentious around the idea of clean transition or green transitions and so on. We see, for example, in the coal belt, the challenge of climate politics in the US. Because a lot of the folks, their livelihoods are very tied to this. Think about in the African context, in less developed countries within Africa, where the extractive industries or fossil fuels, oil, is their last and only option, their first, last, and only option. And so there is a much deeper, I think, challenge there, which there has been a lot of progress, there has been a lot of talk. And it is happening nationally, but then it is within a global world order that it seems like it's shifting in the geopolitics. We've seen it in climate politics with, you know, the BRICS nations, and it's, you know, we're seeing it in the COP negotiations on climate change and the Paris Agreement, with African countries themselves being a bloc. And then there's also the SIDS, and then there are the Arab nations and so on. But even then, there has not been enough traction. And only recently, we have moved forward in operationalizing this idea of loss and damage. Because there is a colonial legacy and there's an imperialist legacy which produced imperialism and colonization, wars and conquest have eroded the environment. There has been a re-spatialization of the environment from what it was. It has been transformative of the relationship that people had with the environment. And I would argue, even at similar levels of what the Industrial Revolution did for Europe. And so I think that some of those issues need to also be addressed. So there's a local, national, or meso level, and then there's a global structure. And so there is need for reform at the same time.
You're also dealing with human nature.
And you're also dealing with
you
human
were
nature.
talking about an
Yes.
historical lens going back to the 60s. I'm
Right.
an archaeologist.
Mhm.
My historical lens goes back 5,000-6,000 years at least.
Right,
Didn't look pretty back then either.
right,
Human nature,
exactly,
which is tough to change.
yes.
Anyway, that sounds too pessimistic. You know, any questions here in the room or from our Zoom audience?
I see a couple.
I have a couple questions, but a couple of questions have come in from the online space, so thank you very much. First from
unshare
Tim Weisgall. Do you want to unmute him and
Sure.
share your question? And then we also have Mark Fordenberger asked something, so go ahead, Tim.
Well, I want to underscore the importance of what you've done here. And in fact, it's quite important to look at the non-synced character of the discussion, because development issues are being linked with historical issues. And there are lots of opinions on development issues that aren't very well informed by the historical material. So in a sense, it's useful to unravel one from the other. And the colossal impact of what our archaeologists just underscored here, namely the tens of thousands of years, and in geologic time, hundreds of thousands of years of change are occurring so fast that's in a geological split second, in a sense. And the fate of Africa at this point is in real trouble, not because of consensus problems or even language problems, but because of geologic crises that are occurring close to the African continent, but in its closest continent, Antarctica. The melt rate and movement of glaciers in Antarctica is going to wipe out populations on coastal regions. The legacy of the colonial period was to attract people towards the coasts. Demographers refer to this as the marginalization of Africa. By this, they do not mean that Africa has become less important. What they do mean is that Africa's population since 1492 has moved from the center of the continent to the margins of the continents. Now, when you get the majority of the population focusing on the margins of continents for habitat and for agriculture and for fresh water, at the same time that sea level is rising at exponential rates, right? Not just steadily, but very unsteadily and very, in a sense, predictably, because of what's happening in Antarctica. You're going to get tens of millions of people that are in search of fresh water, arable land, and habitation in the next 3 to 4 decades. That means a lot of people on the move and the resurgence of public health problems that we haven't seen in historic time. This is, again, where we need the help of archaeologists to call upon biblical scale crises. And it requires biblical scale responses. That is, the nation state is not an effective means of responding to this. Calculations by Oxfam and others have actually put the numbers on how many trillions of dollars will be needed to save coastal cities in third world countries. And that money is not forthcoming from the nation state apparatus, which has largely been ossified in the UN system, where nation states have, in a sense, sovereignty and can veto things from one another. So we're up against huge problems that will have much more to do with the way humanity starts to empathize with one another, rather than the way nation states respond to their own publics within the boundaries. I wondered if you've been in touch with some of the groups working in Africa on this scale. The agriculturalists are actually the ones who are most alarmed, because they're the ones who have been realizing that the African city on the coast cannot be supplied by the food generating capacity within their own countries. And that the increasing dependence on foreign sources of food is going to be what's coming down the line, and it's already underscored in the Gaza Strip and in Haiti at this point, where basically millions of people are dependent upon the transport of food supplies from thousands of miles away.
Thank you, Tim. If you can respond.
Yes.
We can just have a few minutes left,
Okay,
so we'll
yeah,
take one more question after your response.
Yes, Tim. I mean, that has been, and that's why I call it this quagmire, or these paradoxes of meaning. Because yes, there are archaeological, I'm putting my archaeologist hat on as well, but there are deeper, I would say, arco-ecological crises happening. And again, the idea of coastal communities or coastal cities is very important. So global logistics present a challenge for food security, and we saw this during the pandemic. We saw it with the war, the conflict in Ukraine at the start of the grain, the issues around grain and so on. And just to think that these bursts of political challenges can create devastating impacts on countries in Africa, particularly sub-Saharan Africa. And yes, along the coast are vulnerable, highly vulnerable communities. I have worked with some scholars that are working on these issues. A paper I wrote some time ago looked at this idea of climate smart agriculture and the idea of kind of shifting the ecological systems themselves to be resilient. There has been some, there's been some growth in these areas in Kenya with different climate resilient seed products and legumes and coffees and so on that are pretty much the main crops for these different countries to try to address the issues of income and also food security. But yeah, it's a deep challenge, and I like the way you put it. It's a crisis of biblical proportion. But I don't think the resources have so far matched this, and the state-centric way in where the world has been organized cannot do it. But that state centrism is replicated in international organizations. We are seeing some breakaway with regional kind of organizations and alliance building and so on, for example, with the BRICS nations and so, but let's see where that goes. For now, it's still kind of iffy.
So we are unfortunately close to out of time, or we are out of time, but I will read one last question for you to address briefly, Christopher. Thank you so much. And then I will also save the chat box to send to you because there's lots of constructive comments and feedback that have come in from our community. So from Mark Vardenberger, the focus was on Ujamaa as a case example, but what about in other countries? Are there examples of deliberate creation of eco-villages? If so, how and by whom?
Yeah, there are, thanks for the question. Yes, there are different examples of it, of eco-villages around the world. I mentioned earlier in the presentation that there's a eco-village network that registers eco-villages that live up to their principles, and you can visit their website. And there's over 10,000 right now. But there's also, these are the formal ones. There's also like informal ones, but the ones that we can actually test and measure for the most part, that are kind of implementing these values around sustainability, communal living, clean energy or renewable energy and so on. Some of the most successful ones, I mean, there are Sweden, Denmark they have really successful ones. In the US, there are like about 500 eco-villages that are registered. A lot of them in New England and California, some in the Midwest. But there are in various countries around the world. India, Israel. Israel also kind of pioneered their eco-villages, kibbutz or so on, earlier along with Ujamaa, and so there was always this comparison between them, whether, if they were implementing these principles and so on. So there are these broad, it is a movement, and so you have ones that have been in existence formally for 6-7 decades, and then there are new ones now being created, and they're now calling them more sustainable communities or eco co-housing communities.
So thank you so very much, Dr. Corona. We appreciate having you with us and for this wide-ranging presentation. I will make sure to send you all of the rest of the comments we did not have time to address today.